This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and today's interview is being recorded on the premises of the 2016 conference of the Association for Israel Studies here in Jerusalem. My guest today is a doctoral fellow in government and international affairs at Virginia Tech University in the United States, whose research focuses on balancing security interests and economic opportunity with regard to the natural gas deal that was recently ratified by the Israeli Knesset, about the participation of private companies in the exploitation of a sizable natural gas field that was recently discovered offshore that may, for the first time in Israel's existence, make it energetically self-sufficient. Gabriel Mitchell, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So let's start with a more principled question. Balancing security needs and economic opportunity. Are they necessarily at odds with each other?
No, not necessarily. And I think that when you look at the formation of state energy policy, there's a very clear interest in balancing and trying to manage that kind of balance, while understanding that the state may not necessarily have the same set of interests as the public. And part of what I was looking at is essentially the separation between the rhetoric used by state officials, the Prime Minister, Minister of Energy, experts within that kind of central decision-making circle, as opposed to the opposition voices, which were more focused on the public interest, economic balance, and reducing the price of energy for the average citizen.
Why does the Israeli gas deal serve as a noteworthy case study?
Well, it serves as a noteworthy case study because it's an example of a country that, at least historically, has been energy dependent. In fact, there has virtually been no energy in Israel during its short history, and all of a sudden, discovering gas and oil offshore, having a degree of energy independence that perhaps can change some of the relationships and ways that it interacts with its broader environment, but more importantly, changes the economics of the Israeli state.
Mm-hmm. And where does national security come in?
National security, depending on who you ask, could be the central issue. Certainly what I've looked at is how the state has created an argument within the public discourse that the energy is an issue of national security, that exporting the gas to its neighbors is central to national security, and as a result, in many ways has dismissed some of the critiques of the framework deal that it had arrived with with Noble Energy and with the Dell Group.
Okay, so take us through really the main bones of contention within this hugely controversial issue that was only recently closed. What were the arguments for and against?
Well, essentially the criticisms of the framework deal were based on economics. It was based on revenue sharing. It was based on the import-export policy. It had to do with environmental policy. It really had to do with the issues that were domestic and core to the average Israeli citizen and to opposition groups. It's unclear as to whether those opposition groups were reflective of the majority of the Israeli public or perhaps just a portion of the Israeli public, but either way, it grew en masse to a point in which the government could not ignore the criticisms that were being levied at it for essentially using a policy from the 1950s, the 1952 petroleum law, that was not up to speed with the 21st century and needed a lot of work.
What were the provisions of that?
So in particular, the Israel petroleum law had a 12% interest that the government would take from any company that was extracting energy resources from it. That 12% was based on the fact that Israel was being boycotted by the oil-producing Arab states, and as a result of that boycott, the boycott extended to any company, international company, that may want to invest in Israel. So to attract international investment, and obviously in 1952 they thought that there was domestic oil and they were sadly mistaken. Mm-hmm. They lowered the number in order to attract investment. Mm-hmm. Now in 2016 there's gas and there's potentially oil, and suddenly there's a realization perhaps those laws need to be tweaked a little bit here and there, obviously to maximize the state's revenues, but also to impact the average citizen.
And why did those who adhered to that outdated provision from 1952 were so adamant about sticking to it?
I don't think that there was anybody who was really adamantly sticking to that policy. I think that there was a commitment to the framework deal that had been used with Noble Energy and the Delek Group, and a belief that the deal, first and foremost, needs to serve the foreign policy and security interests of the state. And while it was on the priority list, the economic issues were on the priority list, it was perhaps a little bit further down on the table, and the central decision makers were looking first at the foreign policy objectives, the security objectives that this energy resource could potentially bring to the state.
In terms of exporting?
In terms of exporting,
yes.
And
therefore bringing international revenues.
Correct. Bringing international revenues, which is obviously an important part of energy security, but also in strengthening Israel's position regionally by creating pipelines with, obviously, the Palestinians and the Jordanians. It's been talked about ad nauseum, but also potentially with other actors, Egypt or Turkey. Cyprus and Greece have been mentioned, although that's not a very realistic route. And in a way, effectively doing a couple of things. First, balancing out perhaps Iran's influence in the region. This is part of the rhetoric that's existed, perhaps thwarting boycotts and sanctions from Europe, because the moment that the Cypriots and the Greeks are receiving Israeli gas, then they will vote against any kind of sanctions and measures against the Israeli state. So everything's been kind of framed within the argument of, I would say, a very realist foreign policy and about power and how energy can impact Israel's geopolitical standing. And the economics were important and obviously essential, and there were multiple committees conducted, by Eitan Shishinsky and others. It's not to say that it wasn't a priority, but the first priority seems to be, and it's certainly, if you look at the discourse, the rhetoric used by Prime Minister Netanyahu before the Supreme Court, it's about security, national security. It's about exporting the gas in order to serve Israel's interests and strengthening its regional position and perhaps leading to regional cooperation.
Would they have not been able to do that even if they had raised the threshold, that percentage?
They absolutely would have.
Okay, so it was a policy decision after all. It wasn't any sort of constraint.
Correct. And I think that we need to be a little bit fair in the sense that lacking a rich history of energy resources and a rich kind of public and parliamentary debate about how to deal with energy resources, this has been perhaps a contentious issue for the last 2.5 to 3 years. But admittedly, in the last 2.5 to 3 years, there's been a lot of movement, and both the Israeli public and the government has really revised and has reached a point in which they've had to rethink a lot of the original principles in which the state was using vis-a-vis energy resources, and I think all to the better. It may not satisfy everyone. These kinds of debates rarely do, but there has been a moving of the needle.
So to you, as a scholar of national security, it actually serves as perhaps a golden case study here again. I mean, this is really Israel's national security policy along the years in a nutshell. Security comes first, and even though we could have somehow incorporated beneficial economic issues into it, still it's the golden calf. We all bow to the national security, and that's the end of it.
I think that sometimes it can distract actors from looking to attentively other issues, and certainly from a discursive perspective, using securitization can oftentimes eliminate opposition voices. And listen, I'll let opponents to the framework deal make their claims that perhaps that that the security argument is weak or perhaps faulty. I certainly would say that there's certainly a strong argument that energy has an important role to play in any nation's security, both economic security and its sovereignty. But I also think that, when you look at these kinds of relationships between a state, a foreign company, a domestic company, but a private company, and the potential of exporting to other states, there are a lot of factors that need to be considered, and certainly the public interest needs to be considered as well.
But at the end of the day, it's really all about the extent of the government sovereignty, isn't it? It's whether the government can make long-term policy decisions by virtue of being the elected government or not. Doesn't it really boil down to that?
Well, one of the interesting things about Netanyahu's speech before the Supreme Court in the language was that he essentially wanted to lock in future governments into a certain policy. And one of the things about national interest, and one of the topics that I essentially was looking at for the sake of this conference, is that national interest is a set of core values and goals that are adhered to by central decision makers, the state, over a period of time, regardless of whether the government switches from perhaps more socialist, perhaps more conservative, perhaps more capitalist. Regardless, those are central, unchanging, persisting interests and values over time. So it's interesting that there was some kind of clause to kind of lock in future actors. I actually would argue, regardless of what the future governments may be, they will likely view the gas or any kind of future energy resources much the same way that it's been viewed by this particular Netanyahu government. Mm-hmm. I don't think, for the sake of example, had there been a different result a year ago in the elections, and we had, for the sake of example, a Zionist union government, that they would necessarily look at the energy differently. Perhaps the priorities may be a little bit shifted here and there, but I don't think that the ultimate priority would be any different than security and foreign policy interests.
That's because some would say that there's very little daylight between the economic policies of Likud and the Zionist Union.
Quite possibly.
Yeah, but that's a different issue.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, all we're discussing here is really a textbook example of first world problems, right? I mean, the gas deal has benefited the Israeli economy and Israel's national security, regardless of whatever framework deal would have been signed.
It's certainly something that a state, any state, whether it be first world or third world, can use to its advantage when managed properly, when balancing the appropriate interests, both economic and security interests. So obviously a state like Israel that has a robust public interest, a robust public debate, a robust discourse between the state and the people, you would imagine that eventually they'll reach terms that are not only in the best interests of both parties, but in the best interest of future generations as well.
To what extent do you think that Israel's newly found energetic self-sufficiency could permeate or perhaps translate into the diplomatic realm? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, it gives Israel fewer incentives to reach out to its neighbors and maybe try and get some sort of diplomatic arrangement with them.
So I think that there's a lot of debate over this. There are theorists who argue that pipelines have the ability to increase cooperation and peace between those two ends of the pipeline. And there's a lot of criticism of that theory because in most cases, in fact, there are no cases in which pipelines have been proven to increase the degree of cooperation and peaceful relations between two states. There is an argument, however, that if two states have pre-existing strong ties and trust between them, that a pipeline would not tarnish or in any way damage their pre-existing relationship. But I do think that there's something to be said about the value of exporting energy and natural gas elsewhere for the sake of strengthening neighboring economies, in particular the Palestinians, the Jordanians, but the gas can come from somewhere else. The important thing is having energy sufficiency and security so that those economies can remain stable over a long period of time. It's in Israel's interest that the Palestinians have a stable economy. It's in Israel's interest that Jordan have a stable economy. It's almost of secondary importance as to where that energy comes from. And if it comes from Israel, great. But it's difficult to say with absolute certainty that if there's a pipeline between Israel and Jordan, therefore their diplomatic relations will be strengthened.
Do you think the Israeli government realizes that with relation to the Palestinians?
I think that it does. I think that there's the obvious challenge of where revenues go and how they're used, and you could definitely see both sides of the coin. The impact of energy, perhaps, on the economy of Gaza would be astronomical. Alternatively, it could be used by Hamas the wrong way and used to simply supply their military apparatus with more weapons, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very tough line, and ultimately it leads to a lot of indecision rather than decision.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether my main takeaway is I should be optimistic or pessimistic, but that's all we have time for today.
I would say that the key is being realistic.
Realistic. Okay, it's somewhere in between.
Yeah.
All right, Gabriel Mitchell, a doctoral fellow in government and international affairs at Virginia Tech University. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Alex Benish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
הוא אמר יהיה בסדר והפיל את הרצפה, היא אמרה יהיה בסדר, כבר נמצא לך פרצה, אל תדאג עד מחר ישכחו ממך ותחזור למשפחה.